Okay, so yeah, I hope that's been useful. I know that some of this probably has, some of you probably already knew a lot of this, if not all of this. Some of you may have already been using layout techniques, and maybe some of this has helped to create some of those kind of like aha moments. And then for some of you, it may still feel a little bit, it may feel overwhelming. And that's okay. You have to just be ready to persevere. And the reason why I give you homework is because the only way to get better at something is through practice and repetition. So it's crucial. For some of you, it might feel a little bit tedious because you know a lot of this, but again, you have to practice these things. So in the meantime, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about homework, but if you have any questions, then feel free to post them. And alternatively, of course, you can just talk with me as well. But just to tell you about the homework for this week, and of course, I will add a task onto the dashboard. I'll write it in the chat and everything, so you don't have to make any notes now. But what we're going to do for homework is take everything you've learned so far, and you're going to build another one-page website, okay, for a company, a fictional company or anything. So it's the same concept as last week, but the difference here is I want you to take a mobile-first approach to the design, okay? So you're designing for a mobile phone, but you will then incorporate media queries to make sure that the website responds to a larger screen size, such as the desktop. So as you're doing this, see if you can incorporate flex or grid into your website. And then any CSS that you use normally can be placed inside of a media query. So there's, maybe you could try using some of the kind of flex or grid options inside of your media query. In other words, you can, that's how you would take a one column layout and turn it into a 2-column layout, is by changing some of the flex properties inside of a media query. So that's kind of the homework for this week. For some of you, maybe who haven't completed the homework from before, that's okay. Just try to work on these things as and when you can. Bear in mind, next week, I'm not going to give you homework, but next week will be kind of the end of this module. So that space or that time off from homework, hopefully you can start to just either catch up on homework or figure some things out before we start to move into JavaScript. Okay, so questions, anybody? Who has a question?
Hello, sir.
Oh, hi there. Who am I speaking with?
This is Raji.
Oh, hey, Raji. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good, good.
Thank you. Last, I think you've discussed this before. The topic on positioning with what do we call it? Positioning, yeah, with relative and absolute and static and some other property like that. I cannot remember now. So I want to know how one can handle this particular scenario that I want to put in front of you now. When you use this positioning property for a particular section of the page, the moment you want to add another section below it, everything will keep moving beneath the first one, the first section, I mean. So I have to give every section a top CSS property with big figure, or let me say value, to push it down. For instance, 100 pixel as in top, 100 pixel to make it fall beneath the first section. So So I don't know how to handle this, and it has been giving me headache since that. Oh, this, how a person handle this? Is it proper for someone to be giving it all those kind of big that will sometimes make it to break, because it will create another big space downward after everything? Please, did you understand my question? Please.
I think so. Yes, I understand what you mean about say having top 100 pixels, and then the next thing you have to do maybe top 200 pixels and so on.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Thank you. But
okay,
on issue of positioning with relative absolute of a thing.
okay. So right. Okay. So what I am going to say might sound a little bit rude. Okay, but bear with me. So it sounds like you have been designing a website in the wrong way, because there should not really be scenarios arriving where everything or many items are being positioned with relative, absolute, fixed, static, sticky, or whatever. There are a few elements on a page that would require it, unless you're creating something very specific. But an example of something that you may use position absolute or position fixed or something like that might be a navigation panel at the top of a page. Or maybe you've got, you might remember I said about maybe if you've got like a little button that you just want to always be in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen at all times, maybe like a button you can press to activate a live chat or something like that. So these are some instances where you might need to use something such as position absolute or position relative and all of that. You might also use it maybe if you're trying to create CSS art, like you're specifically trying to draw something and you're just using CSS for fun. But the layout techniques that we've discussed today are what you should be using to do layouts. I deliberately didn't tell you about these, say, last week or the week before, because it's important that I try to almost hold all of your hands as we kind of go through this journey, and not just give you the kind of the most complex things at the start, even though they may be the most useful things. So I would say this: whatever you've designed so far, I would start again. Okay, I would not use position absolute, position relative, and all of that. They're for specific things. I would recommend, I should say, that you take your design and you try to do it with flex or grid. One thing that I always do when I'm trying to design a website is I will just draw it on a piece of paper first. So let's imagine that I am creating this website here. Maybe I want a nav bar. So let's just call that nav. Maybe we've got a main section here and a side and a footer. Okay, so we've got main, a side, footer. So terrible drawing, and I'm sorry if it's backwards from what you can see here. So we've got a nav, a main, and a side, and a footer. So once you've drawn this, then you can start to think, oh, actually, cool. Okay, that's cool if it's not backwards, Axe. It is for what I can see on the screen. That's why. Okay, if you've got something like this drawn, then you can start to think in your mind, what CSS properties do I need? So this is how you should be doing things. We're all too eager to write code without actually thinking. And first, we try to think as we go along because it feels more productive, but it's not in the long run. Coding is 90% preparation, 10% coding. You have to remember that. So if we've got something like this, then okay, I can think, well, okay, I've probably got a container that's maybe flex, or maybe I haven't. Maybe it's just I've got 4 elements or something. But okay, I know this needs 100% of the width. I know this needs maybe 75%. I know this needs 25%. I know this needs 100%. I know I'm going to need maybe 2. I'll need 2 columns here, 1, 2. So if I'm doing a grid, I might need 2 columns, and so on. Like, the more time you can spend on that, it makes it a lot easier to write code. That's why when I had those examples, I just put display flex on, or display grid, and it more or less just worked. And that was because I had planned it out first. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And I know that was a very long answer for your question, Raji, but I hope that explains a little bit. Okay. Any other questions? I know, Hafiz, I know you had a question for me.
Yeah, I had a question about this nav bar. At that point when you were explaining this flex row, so I was thinking that will that, or is that possible to first make this nav tag and then ul and then l lists and all that, and then we just give a css value that it is a flex and a row? Will it stretch to that level where it should be, like in a row?
Yeah, it will. I mean, that's exactly what I did.
You have in another way, like what was that? Space around.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly what would happen. So let me try and draw this without actually writing any code. So, okay. Right, okay. So let's imagine. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so you're saying something like that, right? Where you've got a nav and you've got 4
yes.
anchor tags. I know it could be list or whatever, but let's just say we've got 4 links in there. Okay, so if we created that CSS, if we created that HTML, it's probably just going to appear like that as a column if we've not done anything to it. Okay, so that's normal. And then if we put display flex, okay, so nav. So if we did that, nav display flex, then that will, I won't continue to draw it, but yeah, it will basically take all of this and put it on one line.
Okay.
So this, to begin with, is block level. Okay. When we do display flex, we're turning it into an inline thing where everything goes in line, in one line, horizontal. Then if we did something like inside of our nav, if we did justify content space around, if you can read my terrible handwriting, I'm left-handed, so sorry. But if it says justify content space around, if we did something like that, then they will still be on one line, but it will spread them out evenly. Not evenly, but it will spread them out across the line rather than them just being there, which is what would happen if you don't do space around. If you just do display flex, then this is almost, it's like it's turning horizontally like that.
And then is it necessary to give also that max width 100%?
Oh, that's a good point. So I would say try it out. Try with and try without, and see if there's any difference.
Okay.
I would believe you don't need to. But I could be wrong, actually, because there would be instances where you do need to put a width of 100% on for certain elements. It depends. It depends sometimes still whether it's a block level or an inline element. So putting display flex on it will change the. It changes the kind of the orientation of something, but it doesn't actually make it an inline element. It just it lays content out in an inline fashion. But it might be then some things you do need to do width 100% for it to actually take up the entire width, if you get what I mean. So try it out. It's the best way to learn. Just try things, and then you pick up things each time you do it. So cool. I hope that makes sense. Did you have any other questions for me, Hafiz?
I have one more, but it is all about what I couldn't understand, this media thing. What I understood is that is it that sometimes if we try a website on a phone and it says that device compatibility error because it has been this website has not been made for phones, maybe is it like that? Or
well, what that will be is that means whatever website you've gone on has not made a website that is actually responsive. So that's a bad practice, really, to say, okay, you're viewing this on a device that isn't suitable, so we're not going to give you any content. But that's basically that is what it could be. Is they're using a media query to determine whether to display that sign or not. But let me give you an example of how we could do this. Let's imagine we've got our nav class here. Display flex. Okay, so let's imagine that that's our code. Okay, at the top we've put nav display flex, so that does what we kind of just spoke about before. Now let's imagine that for some reason we only want. Wait a second. Let's say that for some reason we only want this to happen on mobile devices, but on oh, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so it will not be displayed on a desktop or a laptop. Yeah.
Well, it will, right? So it's still going to appear on a desktop. It's going to appear everywhere, right? So what we've written here is just our regular CSS. Okay. What we're saying is here, this is conditional CSS. It's you write it in the same way, but we're saying we only want this CSS to happen if the device is a minimum width of 419 pixels. So on a mobile phone, whatever we write in here is not actually going to happen. Okay, but on a bigger device, one that's say 420 pixels, it might be that for some reason I want my nav to use something else. I don't know. For some reason, I just want to use block. Okay, so this is not a good example of the kind of thing you would write, but this is how you would write it. So if it's a device below 419 pixels, we're going to use flex. If it's above 419 pixels, then this is going to overwrite this. And you'll see it say, okay, we want to use block instead for some reason. In this case, block means it's probably going to be vertical again. Yeah, so it'll be like that. So far, does this make sense?
Got a bit clearer picture now, and I will read and watch more about it.
Well, what I would suggest is don't just read and watch. Actually try and do it.
Right. Yeah.
So do you have you used Chrome developer tools?
No.
Okay, that's fine. So this is obviously stuff I haven't even spoken with you all about yet. Like, you know, kind of VS Code tips and tricks and extensions and other things you can do. So what I would suggest you try later on is go onto any
page and inspect.
exactly. So so go on any page you like, right click on there and click on inspect. Okay, and then it's going to open up something else where you can see elements and things like that, and you can see all of the classes and styles in there and things. Some websites that have responsive design, you'll start to see the information appear for certain media queries. And then you can start to actually see what happens for certain screen sizes. Maybe that doesn't make too much sense. And the frustrating thing is I can't actually show you with screen share because it doesn't actually show the inspector. But anyway, the best way to get used to it is to just practice. So create something like that, this media. And then try doing ones with min width and try doing it with max width. Put something in there and then just load it up in your browser and just increase and decrease the width of the screen and start to actually notice the changes happen. So yeah, give it a go. And then if you get stuck with anything, of course, you know, you can just ask any of us in the chat and we'll try and help.
Yes, thanks very much.
Cool. Anything else, Hafiz?
Thanks very much.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Oh, actually, I can see one from RK. So what's the best way to test on all browsers, mobile, tablet, viewports? Should I download all browsers in addition to using Devtools? So that's a good question. Yes to most of it, really. So any developer really should have a lot of browsers on the computer. So, you know, Chrome, Firefox. If you have a Mac, then Safari. If you've got a Windows computer, then Edge. If you even manage to get Internet Explorer somehow, then install it. And that's a good way to test things. But yeah, a really good way is in Devtools. In fact, that was something I should have mentioned to Hafiz that I kind of missed. So when you open Devtools, there is a button in the top left-hand corner. There's the first button that has a kind of mouse clicker on it, and then there's a second button which says it says toggle device toolbar. Now, when you open that, it gives you the ability to set the width and the height along with lots of different device sizes. I'm guessing this is what you're talking about anyway, RK, when you mention this. So that is pretty much the quick way to test things. You know, for the most part, we're not really going to be in a position where you can just test on hundreds of different devices, although there are services that offer that. But you know, on a day-to-day thing, that's what I would do. I'd have a couple of browsers open, and I would be using Devtools to just stretch the screen and decrease the screen and things like that. Any other questions? If anyone would like to speak, you are more than welcome to. Oh, we've got a couple. Okay, so I saw Axe and Michael. So Axe, if you'd like to speak first.
Hey, Sunil.
Hey.
So I went down like a crazy rabbit hole over the weekend while looking at one-page CSS websites. And I came across classless CSS frameworks. And that's the kind of rabbit hole I went down. And, you know, I mean, I spent hours on a couple of websites just looking at the code. I was just curious about where they're used, how one might use them, because I didn't see any obvious advantages of adopting any of the frameworks that I saw. So I was just curious about that. I mean, I don't have any questions that are directly related to what you covered today.
Okay, no, that's all good. So, okay, when you say classless frameworks, are you referring to things such as Tailwind?
Not Tailwind specifically, but actually things kind of like Tailwind. There are just a few classless frameworks that that devs have come up with. One was called water.css. Another one was called new.css. And they're fairly simplistic websites. They don't have, I think they're designed for text-heavy content because there are very few images on it. But yes, Tailwind is also like one example, I suppose. But I was just curious about where classless frameworks are used, what the advantages are.
Right. Okay. So good question. And this is actually the third and final part of the CSS
okay.
kind of section. So it's about writing maintainable and scalable CSS. And there are a bunch of different techniques, but the one that, from what I gather, what you're referring to is known as something called a utility first approach, where there are these kind of frameworks and libraries that basically already have the CSS written, and you can just use those classes on your HTML elements. So the CSS exists already. You just import it. And then you just use it rather than kind of writing each line of CSS manually as one may do. They have advantages to them in the sense of it reduces the amount of CSS you have to write, so it reduces the need to work on that part of it. It can increase productivity when you're doing things like prototyping, and there are a bunch of frameworks and technologies for things like that as well. And some people just like doing it. I mean, CSS is, although I started the lesson saying that CSS layouts are complicated, but they don't have to be. CSS as a whole is complicated and can be frustrating, and using some of these kind of classless libraries and things like that help to reduce that burden, because it's kind of battle-tested code that you don't have to write yourself. Lots of people use it, so it's reliable. And there are sometimes a lot of gotchas in CSS, such as something that you write that works fine for 99% of people, doesn't work for the 1% who are maybe using an old version of Internet Explorer. And some of these libraries that you mentioned already have all of the kind of fallback code to make sure that your designs still look good on every device rather than just 99% of the devices. But it's a good question, and it's something we'll explore a little bit next week, because it is important to understand them.
Some of the ones that I looked at. I mean, Tailwind. Other than Tailwind, there's the ones that I looked at. Well, actually, I shouldn't have said classless, because I think there were no class CSS frameworks, in that they hadn't declared any classes at all in the code. That's what I thought was kind of strange and interesting at the same time. So
right, okay. Let me just double check this, because I think I know what you're referring to, but I just want to have a look at some of the code to make sure I'm understanding this. So okay, so what's happening here is that there is CSS still, and well, let me just make sure this is my understanding of your understanding, I should say. When you say no class CSS, what is your understanding of that? What does that signify to you?
That there were no class declarations in the CSS code. Am I right, or am I wrong in thinking that that's what it is? That's what's it about?
Well, you're right and wrong in a way, right? Because it's confusing, right? What it means is, in that regard, it means the CSS exists. There is a CSS file, but the CSS declarations are based on elements, HTML elements, and not specific classes. So,
right.
there would be, for example, some CSS declarations that exist for a H1, for example, but there isn't a container class, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of declarations for tags, like the p tag, for example, or even just the HTML tag for the entire document in some instances, but no classes like you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just that really, and do you know what? To be fair, that is a slightly different. It's the same question you asked, but there's a slightly different answer for me to give, I guess,
Okay.
based on my kind of newfound understanding. So, okay, so in those regards, that sounds to me more like that's a style guide. They're style guides. So,
I see.
if you want to make something that looks, it just has a specific, it's almost like browser defaults, but it could be the default for making a nice looking text document. And it might be that you use one of those things.
Right. That's actually what a lot of those websites look like. They look like, I mean, they would be great for maybe creating help documents for an app or something like that.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. So it might be things like that, like a help for an app, the documentation for an app, something like that. Yeah, that's all it is really. But to be fair, I've never used them before, but I could definitely see some use in that. I'm a little bit, I don't know whether it's old-fashioned or old school in that regard, but I like writing my own CSS because I enjoy the challenge of it and the process of learning new things. I think when you lean on frameworks too much, you kind of reduce the learning opportunity. I mean, you learn a framework, but you don't learn the fundamentals. But yeah, good question. So Michael, I believe if you're still there, you raised your hand kind of shortly after Axe did. Are you still there? And if so, feel free to ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, hey, yeah, I can. Is that Michael?
Yeah, that's Michael.
Hey, Michael.
Yep. Thank you so much for today's section. Thank you for taking out your time to share your wealth of knowledge and experience with us. So my question is this. I want to know, how much CSS does one need to know as a backend engineer? Because, backend engineers seem to major on the technical stuff. So how much CSS is okay for backend engineers? Thank you.
Good question, and thank you for being so kind as well with your words. So, Michael, if you're still there, can I ask you, do you have a?
Okay, I'm still here.
Okay, great. Are you from a backend? Do you have a background in backend engineering, or are you just asking because you're curious?
I have a background, sort of. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So that's an interesting one, because generally you would think somebody who works in backend doesn't need to know about CSS, or kind of doesn't really need to have that kind of knowledge, because it's typically something that you would expect a front-end engineer or maybe a web developer to have knowledge of, kind of CSS. So my answer would be a back-end engineer shouldn't really need to know anything about CSS, but a base level understanding would help. Sorry, just bear with me one moment. So yeah, I just had to mute everyone because there was some background noise. So yeah, I don't think a back-end engineer really needs to know about CSS. It shouldn't really fall in their job description to be to be designing. If your question was something else, such as how much CSS should a designer know, I would say any good designer would have a really good understanding of CSS. But how much should a back-end engineer have? I would say none. Any that you learn is just a bonus and is kind of an additional skill that you can put on your CV or anything like that. So my answer is none. They shouldn't need to know any. Any other questions? Okay, right. I will take that as no, that there are no further questions. So really good session, everyone. Really enjoyed going through this with you. I will add the homework onto the Stackademic dashboard. I'll write about it in the on Discord as well. And as always, any kind of positive words that you can put on Twitter helps so much. Tag me in it if you want. Tag Stackademic HQ in it. All of that helps so much and helps us to just grow. So, yeah, thank you, everyone. And we'll see you all next week.